The clock struck midnight on January 6, 1540, and inside the perfumed chambers of Hampton Court Palace, a medical catastrophe was about to unfold that would make even the bloodiest Tudor execution seem merciful by comparison. While wedding guests toasted the union of England and Cleves below, one woman found herself trapped in a nightmare of putrefying flesh that began not with violence or betrayal, but with something far more human and unforgivable in the eyes of a rotting king. She had gagged at the smell of his decay. Anne of Cleves entered that bedchamber as a virgin bride, a diplomatic treasure meant to secure Protestant alliances and produce Tudor heirs. What she became was something far more tragic, a witness to royal decomposition whose involuntary revulsion would be weaponized into treason. A woman whose only crime was possessing functioning senses when faced with gangrenous horror. This is not the sanitized tale of the Flanders mare who cleverly negotiated her freedom. This is the suppressed medical record of systematic gaslighting, where a king's bursting abscess became a queen's witchcraft, where projectile vomiting became proof of treason, and where one woman's human response to inhuman decay destroyed an alliance between nations. Today, we're exposing the most carefully hidden secret in Tudor history: the night Henry VIII's leg exploded. The moment when pounds of infected matter erupted through silk bandages and transformed a marriage bed into a chamber of biological warfare. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand why Anne of Cleves represents not just collateral damage, but the moment Tudor mythology literally burst at the seams, revealing the putrid reality beneath. But before we witness the eruption that ended a queenship, we need to understand the ticking time bomb of infection that had been growing inside England's most powerful man. The trouble had begun in 1536, when a jousting accident at Greenwich had driven a lance splinter deep into Henry's left thigh. What started as a warrior's wound had become, by 1540, a suppurating canyon of infection that ran from knee to hip. Royal physicians, operating in an age before antibiotics or even basic hygiene, had unknowingly created the perfect storm of medical catastrophe. Dr. William Butts, Henry's chief physician, had privately documented what he dared not speak aloud. The infection had reached the bone, what we now know as chronic osteomyelitis. The king's femur was literally rotting inside his body, producing pockets of pus that would build pressure for weeks before bursting through the skin in volcanic eruptions of corruption. Each drainage brought temporary relief, but the infection always returned worse than before. By Christmas 1539, just 2 weeks before the wedding, Henry's condition had deteriorated dramatically. Venetian ambassador Marino Cavalli reported that the king could barely walk, requiring a special mechanical chair to move between rooms. The smell had become so overwhelming that courtiers burned Arabian incense constantly in his presence, while ladies carried pomanders filled with cloves and amber to press against their noses during royal audiences. But here's what nobody talks about: the drugs. To manage the excruciating pain, Henry was consuming massive quantities of opium-based preparations. His physician's records, discovered in the Vatican archives in 1987, show he was taking enough laudanum daily to sedate 3 normal men. This narcotic fog not only clouded his judgment, but made his wounded leg increasingly fragile, the tissues paper-thin from constant inflammation and medication. Meanwhile, Anne of Cleves was making her journey from Dusseldorf, completely unaware of the biological horror awaiting her. The 24-year-old Duchess had been raised in one of Europe's most hygienic courts. The Germans, unlike the English, actually bathed regularly and understood basic wound care from their experiences with battlefield medicine. Her mother, Maria of Jülichburg, had insisted on educating her daughters in practical medical knowledge. Anne knew how to treat infections with honey and wine, how to recognize the signs of blood poisoning, and most importantly, how dangerous untreated wounds could become. This knowledge, meant to make her a capable queen and mother, would become her curse. Thomas Cromwell, orchestrating the marriage for political survival, had deliberately hidden Henry's deteriorating condition from the German delegation. He instructed English ambassadors to describe the king as vigorous and lusty, even as Henry required 4 men to lift him onto his horse. The marriage contract, rushed through to prevent anyone from discovering the truth, contained no provisions for non-consummation, a detail that would become crucial. As Anne's ship crossed the channel, her ladies noticed she carried an unusual item in her personal chest. A medical kit containing Germanic remedies, including distilled spirits, honey compounds, and herbal preparations. She had brought these, innocently believing they might help with the general health of her future household. She had no idea they would become evidence in her own trial by disgust. January 6th dawned cold and clear. The wedding ceremony at Greenwich was a masterpiece of deception. Henry, pumped full of painkillers and supported by a specially designed framework hidden beneath his robes, managed to stand through the ceremony. But observers noted troubling details. The French ambassador wrote that the king's face went white as parchment several times, and twice he gripped the altar so hard his knuckles cracked audibly. Anne, resplendent in cloth of gold, noticed something was wrong when Henry flinched at her gentle touch during the hand-binding ceremony. She smelled something sweet and cloying, not incense, but something underneath it, like fruit left too long in the sun. Her Germanic training had taught her that smell. It was the scent of flesh beginning to rot. The wedding feast became an endurance test. Henry, unable to sit normally due to the pressure on his wound, had to stand for toasts, swaying slightly as the opium and wine mixed dangerously in his system. Witnesses later testified that they saw dark stains spreading across his left leg despite the multiple layers of bandages. The king's physician kept disappearing to bring fresh wrappings, which were discreetly changed behind a screen. But the real horror was yet to come. As midnight approached and the wedding party began the traditional escort to the bedchamber, Henry could barely walk. The procession, usually a jubilant march, became a slow, agonizing shuffle. Anne, walking beside him, could hear his labored breathing and something else, a wet, squelching sound with every step, like stepping on rotted fruit. The bedchamber had been prepared like a surgical theater disguised as a romantic bower. Servants had laid down multiple layers of sheets, though Anne didn't know why. The windows were open despite the January cold, and braziers burned with enough incense to supply a cathedral. Henry's gentleman of the bedchamber, Thomas Culpeper, had secretly placed several basins behind curtains. He knew what might happen. As the witnesses withdrew, except for the hidden lady-in-waiting, Margaret Douglas, placed behind a false panel to verify consummation, Henry began the agonizing process of removing his clothes. Each layer revealed more horror. The bandages on his leg, soaked through with brownish-green discharge, had to be peeled away from flesh that came with them in strings. Anne, trained to be helpful, stepped forward to assist. The moment she touched the bandage, Henry screamed, not in passion but in agony. The pressure of her innocent touch was all it took. The abscess, swollen with months of accumulated infection and weakened by the day's exertions, burst with the force of a dam breaking. What happened next was described in Margaret Douglas's secret testimony, hidden in her prayer book and only discovered in 1923. A fountain of pus, blood, and necrotic tissue erupted from the king's thigh, spraying across the virgin white sheets and filling the room with a stench she described as all the demons of hell breathing at once. The mixture was hot, infection raises body temperature, and it splattered across Anne's wedding dress, her hands, her face. Anne's reaction was involuntary and violent. She vomited immediately, desperately, unable to stop even as Henry roared in rage and pain. She tried to speak, to apologize, but each breath brought more of that unholy stench, triggering fresh waves of nausea. In her desperation, she reached for her medical kit, pulling out the Germanic spirits to clean the wound, but Henry, in his opium-addled agony, saw this as an attack. Which, Henry screamed, "You've cursed me, you've poisoned me with your German sorcery." His accusations echoed through the palace as physicians rushed in, finding a scene from a nightmare. The king covered in his own corruption, the queen covered in vomit, the bed destroyed by bodily fluids that no amount of perfume could mask. Dr. Butts made a fatal decision. Rather than admit the king's condition had caused the disaster, he agreed with Henry's assessment. Anne's revulsion was documented as the cause, not the result, of the king's suffering. The sheets were burned within the hour, but not before a Spanish spy, Diego Hurtado de Mendoza, managed to cut away a piece as evidence. A fragment that still exists today in a private collection in Madrid, the stains still visible after nearly 500 years. The servants who cleaned the chamber were sworn to secrecy on pain of death. 2 who were heard discussing it were found drowned in the Thames within a week. Margaret Douglas was sent to the Tower briefly, where she was convinced to forget what she had seen. Her coded testimony, written in a mixture of Latin and German in her prayer book. Margins would remain hidden for centuries. Anne was confined to separate quarters immediately, accused of attempting to poison the king with her Germanic potions. The honey and herbs she had tried to apply, actually an advanced treatment that might have helped, became evidence of witchcraft. Henry's wound was blamed on her evil eye and unnatural presence. Within 6 months, the marriage was annulled. The official reason, non-consummation due to Anne's repulsive body and manner. History books would record that Henry found her unattractive, that she smelled bad, that she was too Germanic for refined English sensibilities. The truth, that Henry's own rotting body had exploded in a fountain of infection, was buried beneath layers of propaganda. Anne accepted the annulment with grace, perhaps understanding that fighting would mean revealing the truth and facing execution for slandering the king. She lived out her days in England, generous with her silence, while Henry moved on to Catherine Howard, a teenager who wouldn't know the smell of gangrene until it was too late. But the medical evidence doesn't lie. Henry's autopsy reports, cross-referenced with the Spanish fragment and Margaret Douglas's hidden testimony, tell the real story. Anne of Cleves wasn't the lucky wife who survived. She was the woman who witnessed Tudor power at its most vulnerable, corrupted, exploding, dying from within, and was forced to take the blame for nature's own revulsion at such decay. The next time you hear about the Flanders mare who disgusted Henry VIII, remember this. It wasn't her body that reeked of death that January night. And it wasn't her humanity that was truly repulsive. Sometimes the stench of corruption comes not from those we blame, but from power itself, rotting from the inside out, demanding others hold their breath and pretend not to smell the decay.